expecting was it for it to be the exact same as when I was an athlete? And we know that there's some distinct cultural differences between coaches and athletes in a sporting world, as opposed to learners and faculty in the medical context. So what I think are one of the most important roles for us as we roll out these coaching programs is to understand what is fundamentally different about the role of a coach as compared to the other roles that already exist in medicine. For our learners, how do we make sure that we're actually creating a new type of relationship that isn't simply just another meeting that they have to attend or another checklist that they have to fill out? So instead of giving up on this idea of coaching when it initially sort of came into medicine, I've really been working hard to try to understand how do we actually define coaching in medicine, and how do we actually translate these core principles to fit into our own professional culture. And so I think our goal over the course of this workshop is to hopefully shed some light into the role of a coach and the specific skill set that we need to develop in our faculty in order for them to be successful coaches. Next slide. So what exactly is coaching as it applies to medical education? So what have I actually learned in this journey over the last few years searching for a definition? Well, if you look at the literature, there's actually a general appreciation for this fact that coaching is about extracting the highest level of performance from an individual. It's about helping them understand their potential and learning how to get there. Coaching is about this investment in a learner, and it's about promoting their growth and their development. And I would say that while the Royal College asks us to coach to competency, I think we can probably all agree that what we really want is to coach to personal excellence. What's beyond that 4 and 5 on an entrustment scale, right? So even though our learners might be hitting the 4s and 5s, what we really want to be able to do is to tell them what does it look like beyond that level 5, and how does the learner actually obtain that individual potential? And I actually think there's often this misperception that comes with coaching. A lot of people feel that coaching is going to be great for those learners that need support, whether that be with exam performances, professionalism, performance on a rotation. But I'd actually argue that coaching is most exciting for our learners who are actually functioning at the level we expect, or perhaps the ones that are actually functioning beyond our expectations. Coaching will actually afford them some individual attention to help them actually continue to grow beyond our basic competency standards. And I sometimes liken it to the idea of starting on a racetrack, where everyone sort of starts a bit staggered. The reality is that our learners are the same. They come into their residency programs or into medical school at different levels. And the question is, do we actually want them to all finish at the same finish line? Or are we willing to accept that probably there's a level of difference in sort of their potential, as long as they're all meeting these general competency standards? And as a former athlete, I have to say that most times my relationship with my coaches was a love-hate relationship. But if there's one thing that I think defines that feeling of having a coach-player relationship, it's the fact that the investment in my, as an athlete, in my growth and performance is really hard to question, because their job is actually dependent on my success. So how do we emulate that same sense of dedication and commitment to our learners when in fact, our faculty have lots of different responsibilities, and probably their job is not dependent on their learners' success? Next slide. So as I briefly mentioned, I think that one of the things we need to address is we need to account for the difference between these distinct cultural differences in medicine as compared to sports. And certainly I speak about sports because that's sort of the environment that I've come from. But when we look at these domains where we know that coaching is successful, whether that's in the sporting world, in music, in business, coaching is better understood there. And so what we need to really try to understand is how do we actually adopt those principles into our own into our own professional culture. So what are fair expectations of a coach? And similarly, what are fair expectations of our coachees in medicine? So this is what I think I've been trying to really commit myself to understand. And as I personally work on implementing a coaching program at our own center, this is probably where most of my time has been spent, is really truly understanding what is it that we expect of our coaches and our coachees in a medical education context. Next slide. So we often talk about, are faculty in medicine the same as coaches in sports or teachers in music? But I think the other thing we need to think about are, can we compare elite athletes and medical trainees? Do elite athletes and learners require the same thing? And so I often say that it's kind of funny because we know that athletes who need to compete at the highest level, so international, professional, they require coaches. And often they require multiple coaches. And no one really argues that. There's no way that you can get to the top level of your game without a coach. But when we look at medical learners, we're asking them to become the best type of healthcare provider that they can be for the sake of our patients. So if elite athletes know that they need sort of these coaches to help them elevate their game to this level that they may not actually be able to see for themselves, then certainly we would imagine that the same benefit can be afforded to our medical learners who also need to be performing at the top of their game for the sake of patients' lives. So we often talk about learners needing this growth mindset. And we were talking a little bit when we were developing this workshop about the fact that a lot of times there's a little bit of eye rolling now when we talk about growth mindset, because it's a very trendy term that comes up a lot. But I think what we really have to understand is those of us who are sort of ambassadors of taking in coaching is, have we really created a culture by which growth mindset is being promoted and embraced in our learners? Are we selecting people into medicine who have a growth mindset? And are we really making it okay for our learners to fail? In sports, we talk a lot about, failing all the time, but they also have the opportunity to redeem themselves. Are we allowing our learners to redeem themselves within the system that we have right now? I came into medicine from a sport where if you had a batting average of 0.333, which means you're failing more times than you are successful, that's sort of the perspective that I came into it. And so I learned at a very early age that if the coach wasn't yelling at you or picking on you versus some of your other teammates, you sort of had to be worried, because that means they didn't see potential in you. And so as athletes, we're always sort of starving or looking for that constructive feedback, because that means that we still have room to grow. And I think that's what we're looking for in our learners, is we want them to feel comfortable and safe having that same sort of mentality. But what's really interesting is you take someone like myself who had that ingrained in them for more years than I've been in medicine. And as I moved into medicine, I very quickly became sort of re-socialized to this idea that perhaps it's better to be reassured at the end of your rotation or when you get feedback than it was to get this constructive criticism. I would hear faculty talk about being worried about giving negative feedback. You'd hear learners being worried about getting negative feedback. And so I quickly started to readjust my expectations to the fact that maybe I really didn't need much constructive criticism. Perhaps it was better just to be reassured and let the system sort of naturally take me through, because it seems to work out for everybody else. And just recently, I was actually reading an evaluation on a learner, and in the comments, it actually said, the learner was so hardworking and polite that it made it difficult to give critical feedback. And so certainly I think there's still this culture where perhaps we're asking our learners to have a growth mindset, but I think we need to be really mindful of the other sort of messages that we're sending that might say that we're not quite ready for them to be quite that open to growing. And so, there's a quote here that comes up, and it's from a study where they actually looked at previous musicians and previous athletes who were now in medicine. And what was really interesting was this idea that, it highlights this fact that athletes would always expect the coach to have some sort of constructive criticism, because if they don't, that means that they weren't watching them. And so when I actually work with learners, I often will say to them, other than actually trying to simply transmit some medical expert knowledge to you, one of the ways that I actually feel like I can give back to you for all the hard work that you've provided for me in helping me care for patients is the opportunity to get some constructive criticism so that you can continue to grow. And so it's almost like it's an exchange, something that we actually owe to our learners, to be able to provide them with this constructive feedback, to tell them we still think you can get better, and here's how we do this. Next slide. So this is a really great paper. So I think if you're going to read one paper about coaching, I'm very biased, but I would say to read this paper here, because it basically was looking at sports coaches who had no role within medicine. They had a group of people who identified as both having some sort of role in coaching in medicine and in sports. And then they had a third group who had no experience in coaching in sports, but identified themselves as coaching in medicine. And in their interviews, what they looked at is what were sort of the shared philosophies of coaching among these three groups. And then what was distinctly different between coaches in sports as compared to coaches in medicine. So when you look at these shared philosophies, what you can see is that everyone sort of agreed that coaching is this mutual understanding towards growth and development. They talk about unlocking someone's potential. They endorse reflection, and we're going to talk a lot about that today as well. This idea that in order to actually be able to have a successful coaching relationship, it's going to require reflection on both parties. And the last, but probably really important part is that everyone sort of accepted that being able to embrace failure as a catalyst for learning was a really important part of growth and development of the coachee. But then when we look a little bit at these distinct cultural differences, which I think is really important for us to actually understand, because as we look to these other domains to say, coaching is fantastic, we want to bring in coaching because we see it work in these other places, is we just have to acknowledge how there are some very clear differences between how a coach functions in one domain as compared to within medicine. And so the first point sort of speaks to this fact that what was really interesting to them is that the coaches in the sporting world, they talked a lot and they emphasized this idea of reflecting on their own role. So reflecting as a coach about how their actions may have impacted their athlete. But this wasn't actually similarly described in coaches within medicine. That wasn't something that they engaged in frequently. The second point that they talked about was that in medicine, it's actually really difficult for learners to display this vulnerability. And that can be because of the way it might be perceived by the patients that they're working with. But it's also this idea that I think we've built this culture that the need to be coached might be a sign of weakness. And so that was very different between the sporting world and in medicine. The third thing that they brought up was this idea of these blurred lines. So in medicine, the coach can actually jump in and be the player at any time. Whereas in the sporting world, for example, the hockey coach can't jump onto the ice and be a player. And so this identity between being the player and the coach is actually really blurred. It's not well understood. And that's a really important thing that we need to consider. And last but not least, for the fourth sort of point is that they talk about the role of coaches being a very specific skill set. So this idea that just by simply being an athlete in that sport does not actually mean that you'll be a good coach. And I think it's very well understood in the sporting domain that the best coaches were often not very good athletes, and vice versa, that sometimes the best athletes don't actually make very good coaches. And the reason is that coaching is just a very specific skill set. So when we look at our faculty clinicians, we often sort of assume if you're a good clinician, we're sort of putting them into these roles and expecting them also to be really great in these roles as well. But I think what we need to be mindful of is that there are specific skill sets that we need to sort of narrow in on and be able to develop in our coaches so that they actually feel comfortable being in these roles. Next slide. So the big question is, we've talked about this, we've challenged it, exactly, we brought up a lot of ways where perhaps coaching can't be the same, but we're at a coaching workshop and we know that coaching needs to come to medicine. So how do we actually incorporate these principles of coaching into medicine? So I think the biggest question for us is, we know the benefit by which we want out of a coaching program for our learners. So how do we make sure that that's actually what we're intending to do by our actions? Next slide. So we can't do any sort of workshop on coaching without actually addressing the Royal College framework for coaching. And so this comes from the Royal College Physician Surgeons of Canada. And this, we know that coaching is a staple to the success of implementation of CBME, right? So in order to do that successfully, we know that coaching or a coaching program is going to have a big part of that success. And so what they look at here is this idea that there's this resident learner, and there's two sort of frameworks for coaching. One is this idea of coaching in the moment, which is not actually what we're going to focus on today in our workshop. And the other role that we play is this coaching over time, or longitudinal coaching. And we'll talk a lot about that in this workshop, about what that role entails, what skill sets we need, and we'll hopefully build on some of those skills as well today. Next slide. So probably one of the hardest things for people to sort of grasp is, what is really different about a coach as compared to all of these other definitions that we already have, right? There's all these roles in medicine, but where does a coach sort of fit in and blend with all of these? And certainly if you look at the literature, you'll see that there's actually a lot of overlap between all of these different roles. And even, I think Global did a systematic review, it was hard to actually be able to tell which papers were actually talking about principles of coaching when they may have actually labeled that role, a mentor or an advisor. And I think that probably as you look to adopting these coaching programs, or perhaps you already have these coaching programs in place, it's really, really important that everybody, including the learners and the faculty, have a good appreciation for what is actually the role of a coach. What does that look like? What is that skill set? And I think that's what we're really going to try to explore sort of today. The idea here is that coaching is not sort of like a simple transmission of knowledge, right? You're not a teacher in the sense that you're sort of giving them information and sort of impressing that upon them. Similarly, you're not really a mentor. While I'm sure that you could see some blending there, but you're not really using your own experience and expertise to say, hey, this is how you kind of navigate this, or this is how you get it done. In some ways, you can almost think of this idea that in a coaching relationship, the learner is almost more of the expert, because it's actually the learner who has all of this information, but you're actually trying to pull it out of them, help them reflect on it, digest it, and then figure out how to set these goals to actually move forward. And so I think this idea of coaching is it's very bi-directional relationship that you're going to see in a lot of these definitions. And we'll kind of tease out the role like a little bit as we go on. I think I'll talk about it a little bit, and then Heather will talk about it later as well. And I think that will help sort of understand, what is unique about this coaching role as compared to, mentors, advisors, teachers, or all the other types of roles that we have in medicine. Next slide. So this slide actually comes, so that, again, this may or may not apply to sort of the goals that you've decided for your coaching program, but one of the things that, we've been working a lot on is really understanding, before we even define the role or talk about how the program is going to exist, or, how many times are people going to meet, is we really wanted to make sure that we had a clear understanding of what the actual goals were of our coaching program. And so, this is actually adapted from the AMA coaching handbook. And so I invite you to take a look at that resource, which has a phenomenal amount of different articles and frameworks that you might be able to pull. But at the end of the day, I think what's most important is that within your own program, that you have a clear understanding, and that everyone involved, including your learners and your faculty, really know what those goals are. Because in order to really define the role and to really understand what skills people would need, you need to make sure that you're able to measure the success of your program by understanding if you're actually meeting your goals. And so as you look here, this is just an example of sort of the goals that we've adopted, but I think that probably this applies to a lot of people. So there's this idea that, having this longitudinal coaching program, it's actually providing the coachee with this safe space for reflection on academic and professional performance. It's going to be able to assist the coachee in being able to set and reach goals that will lead to high academic and professional achievement and personal satisfaction. And it will encourage coachees to establish habits of longitudinal reflection, self-assessment, goal setting, and lifelong learning. Next slide. So what is the role of an academic coach? And as I said, Heather's going to go through some of the more finite examples, exactly what that looks like. But when you really think about, what is it that we want coaches to be able to do? Here are some of the things that I think it really encompasses the idea of an academic coach. So first, and probably most importantly, is that a coach needs to be able to build an educational alliance with the coachee. They have to be able to demonstrate that they're invested in the coachee's growth and development into an excellent healthcare provider. There's no other real motivation, right, to be a coach other than for your coachee to actually realize that you are fully dedicated and invested in their ability to reach their individual potential. And that's what the next point sort of speaks about. And we really highlight this idea of competency and beyond. So of course, we want everyone to be competent, but we also want to understand where their individual potential may take them past that 4 and 5 on an entrustment scale. A coach really needs to be able to elicit resonant reflection, both on their academic and their professional performance. And that's probably one of the biggest parts of sort of or one of the biggest skills that a coach wants to be able to encompass, is because this is going to be a really important factor, especially in the realm of CBME, where there's going to be tons and tons of data points to try to interpret and sort through. And then last but not least, it's this idea that a coaching relationship will help with this co-creation. So this idea that the coach doesn't make the goals on their own, the learner doesn't, but they actually co-create them together. And they'll actually be able to help keep them accountable to the goals and help them with ongoing growth. How do they see, as a coach, you can kind of see the long-term picture, whereas sometimes as the learner, it's really hard to see past sort of the next rotation or the next week that you're moving into. Next slide. So similarly, when you really distill it down, what are exactly the skills that we need to build in our coaches? What is the skill set that's actually essential to being a successful coach? And so I would argue that these are sort of the main skills that our coaches need to have. And we're going to work on a lot of those today. So the first one is being able to develop an educational alliance. And Janelle's going to speak about that a little bit later. The second one is this idea of goal setting. So probably one of the most important skills that I think that we can develop in both our learners and our faculty is to be able to actually make goals that are attainable and measurable. And we'll speak a little bit about some frameworks for goal setting. The third thing is being able to elicit reflective practice. And I think Mary's going to speak about some of those frameworks that we can look at and actually be able to use in order to help our learners be able to elicit that information. And last but not least, coaches are going to have to know how to kind of work through all of these evaluations and be able to interpret it to actually help the learner be able to reflect on it and set new goals. And I think the nice thing about your role as a coach is that it's not actually your job to form judgments. And that helps a lot with this educational alliance. So at the end of the day, you don't need to agree or disagree, let's say, with an evaluation that the learner finds to be, let's say, quote unquote, negative, or they find that hard to digest. Your job's not actually to judge whether or not you agree with the learner or not. Your job is honestly only to help them reflect on that process and digest it down so you can actually come up with clear goals that sort of show a direction forward. And I think that's the really nice role of a coach, is you have that real neutral relationship. So even though, in some programs, coaches may be at competency committee to sort of present information, they don't have any role in sort of actually making promotional decisions. So it makes it so that they're an ally to their learner because they're fully invested in sort of their growth and development, which I think is a really privileged opportunity that we have as coaches. Next slide. So I talk a little bit about this. I just kind of threw this slide in because I think one of the things as we think about coaching programs is that we're starting to spend a lot of time on developing the coach's role. But I think, what we need to acknowledge is that the role of a coachee is also quite an active role. And so we need to make sure that we remember in our development and our workshops that we're actually looking at how do we develop these same skills, or what skills are actually important for our coachees. And so, as we talk about coaching programs, I think it's also just as important to make sure that we're also bringing our residents into this, or our medical students, and making sure that they actually have a clear understanding of what is their role as a coachee in this relationship. Because certainly, coachees who show up to their coaching relationship in a passive role are not going to get as much out of that relationship as two parties who actually come there with their active sort of their goals. And so this is just a page out of our guidebook for our program. And, something to consider is this idea of actually coming up with a coaching contract, really trying to understand, what are you asking your coaches and your coachees to commit to, so that you can make sure that they're getting the most out of this opportunity. Next slide. So that's kind of this idea of sort of an overview of coaching and a little bit about the role and the skill set that we're hoping that you can appreciate that is unique to coaches within the academic longitudinal setting. I'm going to talk a little bit of goal setting. I think actually I'm getting kind of close on time. So I don't know, Allison or Rini, if we want to open up for a couple of questions or if we should just kind of keep going.
We're pretty much right on time to start overview of the case one.
Okay, so I'll just kind of go the next slide, then I'll just kind of keep going. We can always talk. So the only thing what we were going to do as we move into our first activity is just talk a little bit about goal setting. And so I bring this slide up because this was actually back in 2007 in the Pan American Games, and we had just come back to the Athletes Village and we were met by the decorated, wonderful Marty McBean. And what she had said to us at that time, because we were a year away from the Olympics, is she said, just remember, everyone's going to be training to be a year better. But actually, in fact, your job is to figure out how you're going to be a year and a half better. And so I sort of sat there and thought about that and said, that's actually a really hard thing to do. How do I actually become a year and a half better when chronologically I only have 12 months? And so, that set out this whole goal of, thinking about all the physical and mental aspects of my game and how I can actually become a year and a half better. And what's so important about that is that, you sit down with your coaches and they help you reframe and modify your goals, because they're going to be the ones that help keep you accountable to that. So when you're sort of in the thick and you're burnt out and you're tired, they're the ones that are going to help you remember how to sort of grow and actually be able to meet these goals that you set out for yourself. And so to me, goal setting is such an important part of actually being able to make sure that our learners understand how to go and meet their potential. And I think one of my biggest pet peeves has actually been this idea of learning plans being reactive to poor performance or not meeting expectations, because in fact, all of our learners need learning plans that are continually being modified and adjusted as they move through residency. So next slide. So as we move into activity 1, which I think Heather's going to talk to us about, we just wanted to bring up one framework for goal setting. So when you think about setting goals, what we want you to think about is this SMART goal framework. And the idea is that your goals are both specific, they're actually measurable, they're actionable, they're relevant, and they're timely. And so as you make goals with learners, or as learners, for those that are here that are as learners, as you think about making goals for yourself, you want to make sure that it's meeting all of these criteria. And so I think with that, we sort of go into Heather's introduction of the case.
Okay, good morning. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I think I've turned my mute off. We only have a few minutes before we break into our breakout rooms, and I'm going to start by introducing our first case. So Dr. Alex Liu, she is a resident in internal medicine, and Alison, you can skip to the next slide. So she is a PGY1 in the old framework. So she's in her first postgraduate year, and she is in the foundations of discipline. To set the stage, you are Alex's academic coach, and you will be meeting with her to review her progress. The data that you have, which was in your participation package, and we will make available to you here as well, are 3 pieces of information. One is the learner summary report, which you can pull off MedSys. The second is the resident's self-reflection of her performance. And the third is a learning plan that she has created in advance of your meeting. There's a lot of data here. And so what I wanted to do is break this down into some essentials so that if you haven't had a chance to look at this yet, then we'll all be starting from a common place. So Alison, if you could transition to the next slide. So in her foundations of discipline, I just have a quick summary of how she's doing. There are 7 EPAs, and she has reached 100% of her EPA 1. And 11 of 15 of them are level 5, and all her milestones are achieved. Level 2, I've highlighted, you can see part A is assessment and management, and she's achieved 55% of them. 4 of the 7 that she has have been level 5, but she definitely needs both more observations, more assessors, and more different types of diseases in which these are represented. She has, however, within ongoing management, had 100% of her family communication and handover expectations. EPA 3, she's at 100%, and 5 of 6 are level 5. EPA 4, again, 100%, and most are at level 5 in both part A, which is documentation of the plan, and part B, which is communication. Unstable patient, she's at 87% with 7 of 9 level 5s and all milestones achieved, but she needs 1 disease category which hasn't been represented, which is respiratory distress. Certainly, if this were happening right now in the context of a global pandemic of a pneumonia, she should likely be able to achieve that in the short term. Number 6, goals of care at 100%, and learning needs, which she's not yet submitted anything for. Alison, the next slide. So I've just highlighted a few selected comments. There's many, many, many that you can include or that you can reflect upon, but most comments are excellent. They suggest that she's a strong and confident and competent resident. I've highlighted a few areas that people have commented that she might develop further. One commented that she needs to take more initiative in her leadership in her clinical assessments. She often needs prompting what to do. She has great knowledge, but she needs to be able to apply that into clinical practice. Another commented that she needs to think of considering a broader differential diagnosis. There was another comment where she could continue to work on organized and succinct verbal case presentations. And this is another one, taking into personal pertinent positives, delivering confident differential diagnoses. So again, there is some confidence and some initiative and leadership are all intertwined there, and encouraged to continue to work on time management and efficiency. The next comment that I'm highlighting is she has a good knowledge base and she understands the physiology and pathophysiology of medical conditions. But when she presents these orally, this isn't always evidenced. Her dictated notes, so when she is sitting down to dictate or document by hand, they're very clear and they understand the questions asked and provide a good, concise summary of recommendations. And so the recommendation was to continue to work on communication tips. And then a final comment that I've highlighted here is needing to master the critical appraisal. Alex herself has submitted a bit of a reflection, and she feels she's almost achieved all her EPAs for this stage, and she feels she's doing pretty well. She feels she's getting one of the bigger barriers is getting staff to actually complete the EPA documentation. And that's been a barrier to getting her actual EPAs achieved. And when she reflected on her learning needs, she suggested that being more organized when presenting patients would be helpful. She clearly needs to get more of her EPAs completed, and she would really like to prepare to be a senior resident. This is the end of her PGY 1 year. She's about to transition towards being a second-year resident where she takes on more of a senior role, and she would like very much to prepare for that. She submitted a learning plan, which had 5 learning goals. 1 is to improve her study strategies. 2 is to be more organized when presenting patients. 3 is to get more EPAs. 4 is to prepare to be a senior resident. And 5 is to improve her teaching skills. And you will have access to this in your groups, but this learning plan asks her why she's chosen this, what her timeline for this, the resources that she would need to use, and what she's actually going to do. Asks her to consider what the barriers would be, and then how she will know that she's successful. And so that's something that as a coach, you can use to help her reflect on what she's going to do. So we're at the end of this slide, we're going to break into small groups. There will be someone who can role play the role of Alex. And if one of you can select to be her coach, you can always tag out and have another faculty member or another group member come in and take over if you're finding that you would like a break or you're finding that you're at a spot where you could use some help. And and then at the end of role playing this little session, then I encourage the other group members to provide feedback. So you'll use all of the information we just discussed to practice having a coaching conversation with Alex with a special focus on that learning plan. So we have approximately 25 minutes or so, and we'll split into small groups and we'll see you back at the end. If you have one person from each group, consider what you might want to comment on how it worked in your group. Think about some of the things you might want to share with us when we return. For those of you who took the brave step to be the academic coach in the hot seat, thank you very much for your bravery and for volunteering to do this. We do have a few minutes where it would be great to hear back what the experience was for you in your small groups. Please feel free to speak or to type in the chat. We have a couple minutes to reflect back, and then I'll reflect on some concrete goals of academic coaching.
I can get the ball rolling, Heather, if you like. So I played the role of the academic coach, and Arena played the role of the resident. I think I made an observation that it's been a pretty lonely job being an academic coach during the pandemic. I've not really interacted with any other coaches. I've done it on my on ourselves. We give feedback to the residents. I have to say, we don't really get much feedback as a coach. So having this exercise was actually quite useful, selfishly for me, hearing what other people thought. As a group, we identified that there are several phases of these coaching sessions that we do with our coaches. I think the first was that the session we had was a bit more exploratory, but there are also motivational components to these coaching sessions, and trying to balance them will be something that we probably need to think about. I think one of our group came up with the fact that the way you summarized the EPAs was done so elegantly, and I think some of us are a bit more clumsy as we dig through the EPAs. And so that was one of the things that highlighted to us that part of the coaching job was actually being pretty adept at MetSys and extracting the information efficiently. But otherwise, I think it was, at least for someone who's year 2 coach, I found this experience very helpful.
Thank you for getting us rolling, Kelvin. And I think you're right. I think that those of us who are academic coaches who try and do our best, we don't get a lot of feedback from the trainees, and we're just all trying our best. And so sometimes getting some other feedback or other perspectives on how others do it can be really, really helpful. Did anybody else have any observations from their small group that they wanted to share? Did you find that it was easy to coach the resident through Alex's SMART goal, or Alex's goals were not terribly set up in a SMART format? What did you think about trying to coach them into a direction that was a bit more focused, a bit more tangible, a bit more achievable?
Maybe I can jump in. So I too was the simulated coach. And I think that one of the things, and I'm going to step back and say that when I've done coaching in the past, I've done it in a more organic way for me without that kind of SMART structure. And looking at the learning plan and using that as a stepping stone for having some conversations is actually probably something that is more useful than maybe I thought that it would be. And I know that these educational tools sometimes, when I look at them, I sometimes think, oh, it's just another piece of work for the resident to do. They're just going to do minimal stuff in it, and it's not going to be a useful tool. I know educationally, if you used it right, it would be, but practically speaking, are they going to do it? And I think that Alex's use of the tool is a great example of a very poorly done tool. But working through that with the resident actually can be a helpful way of both setting specific goals and reflecting back on some of the feedback that was given in the various EPA assessments. And so one of the things we didn't get to, but I was going to get to, was, for example, looking at the goal on that SMART feedback form saying, get more EPAs. And then when you look back as your academic coach at the EPAs that were done, and you see that it's like they're specifically choosing to do, or Alex seems to be choosing to do EPAs when she is at the time where she thinks that she's going to get a 5, because there's this dearth of 2s, 3s, and 4s in terms of her O scores. And so having that conversation about growth mindset and being able to start early and get them even before you're ready for doing it would be this could be a stepping stone for that conversation. And if it didn't come up organically in something that they've put down, it can be brought up by the academic coach afterwards as being, you know what, in looking through your EPAs, here's another thing that I wonder if we want to add to your learning goals. So I think it can be a useful tool.
I'm also going to highlight something that Irene mentioned in the chat, if anybody had seen it. And she commented that it's really also quite easy to just celebrate a resident's success when they're performing well and not challenge them to do even better. So coaching a resident who seems to be on track, I think we're all maybe a little bit more comfortable with highlighting deficits. It may be an awkward conversation, but at least we can see where to improve. But when you've got somebody who's performing well and they're achieving their milestones, how do you encourage them to take the next step towards excellence, right? As Robin highlighted a few times, really coaching to personal excellence as opposed to coaching just to competence is another challenge that we'll be trying to achieve. And I see Blake made a comment in the chat as well that applying the SMART structure to each and every goal facilitates granularity and measurable outcome. So the coach role of critiquing this, breaking things down into smaller chunks, keeps motivation up as they're measurable and achievable. Absolutely. So this is one framework. Lots of people may choose this or a different framework, but also using a timeline goal, because a couple of the ones in the framework here that Alex Liu had provided us were like, sometime in the next year, I'd like to achieve this. And so really nailing them down and saying, well, we're going to meet again in 2 months. How can we break that down into something that you'll have achieved in 2 months? What will achievement look like 2 months from there? And so giving yourself something to help that resident transition to can be helpful. Yeah, like I said, by the time I finish residency, which is awesome, you have 4 years, Alex Liu, right? Okay, perhaps we'll transition. So Scott just said the session was helpful for him. Generic statements such as get more EPAs doesn't have a lot of direction. Being specific with goals increases personal accountability. Absolutely. And then Susan has said, perhaps we can encourage residents to take on coaching roles and leading research initiatives when they're achieving superstar status. So that's very interesting, encouraging perhaps in a senior resident capacity. They can start thinking about that. That's a very interesting, right now we've only got faculty in a coaching position, but that might be a way to utilize very strong trainees near, as we get into a transition to practice, that might be a way that we could include people. I'm gonna pop back to our few slides, if that's all right, because one of the things that I always struggle with is translating the theoretical into something practical and concrete. So if we can just go beyond this slide. And there's Sarab, for those of you who haven't met him, in a stock photo. So one of the things that I just wanted to reflect on were a couple of slides around academic coach from a concrete level. So some of these Robin might have focused on as well, but to be a little bit concrete about it, obviously an academic coach would develop this longitudinal relationship. So if it's your first meeting or it's your 10th meeting with this resident, it is something that is going to happen over time, and you have a shared goal of helping them achieve their own personal excellence. As their coach, you will be regularly providing that performance review. You'll synthesize all of those sources of data in order to provide feedback on their progress. And so really the expectation is ahead of time, you will have reviewed their file. You will have your own ideas about where they might develop. If they come with a dearth of ideas, you can start to guide them, mostly through questioning and facilitation, to where you have identified some areas if they haven't been able to come up with any on their own. You'll help the resident reflect on these progress. And then we've talked a great deal in the last half an hour about setting specific learning goals. But then part of it will be the next time you meet with them is to follow up on those action plans. How did it go when you decided that you were going to read 2 pages of Harrison's every single night for the rest of, did that make you a better resident? Did that translate into what you were hoping for? No? Okay, so then let's figure out how we might change that. And then one of the bigger overarching goals is that in doing this and in facilitating in a guided way, we can actually, and there's some evidence to suggest that we can actually improve learners' ability to self-regulate their own learning skills. So we all know that the skill of knowing what you don't know is quite poor right? The Dunning-Kruger effect. However, there is some evidence to suggest that through guided facilitation, we can actually improve people's sense of understanding their limitations. Next slide. So this is, again, you can see that this is a very cyclical diagram. We start in one place, but we're continually renewing our goals. So this, for those of you who are a bit more visual in your preference of how you receive information, if you want to start at the bottom here, we might monitor their progress and collect the data, and then assessing achievement. We would help them interpret the data and select goals and adjust those learning goals according to what information we have. Then we move towards the plan. So what kind of strategies, what kind of actions might you take? And that's where we're developing our goals. And then finally, we ask them to implement these plans, and then we will follow up on that. So that's all really great. But as a coach in the McMaster program, what do you actually have to do? Well, you need to meet with the learner, right? You need to meet with the learner and develop a rapport, establish that shared goal of professional development, the fact that you are here just to support their learning and help to make them the best that they can possibly be. Starting to foster a growth mindset and encourage them, feedback, developmental feedback is very helpful. It helps you to get better. And I'm not here to judge you. I am here to help you to take that information and make you the strongest possible trainee that you can be. Set expectations for the meeting. Early on, just like the contract that Robin showed, you may not have a formal contract, but you set expectations. This is what we're going to talk about. This is how it's going to go. And this is what I want to hear from you. And this is my expectation. What do you want from me? And what might that look like? Ultimately, discuss confidentiality within this group, within you and the resident. Let them know that what the two of you discuss will remain confidential. Discuss what you will share with the competence committee if you will be the one presenting your learner to the competence committee, which we will talk about on the next slide. But also what boundaries, what you will not cover, what you will not ask them. So like about their personal health and wellness, they are welcome to share what they feel comfortable, but there are certain things that you won't ask. If they have questions, you can help direct them to appropriate locations. And ultimately that your goal is, again, reflected right back to the shared goal of their professional development. And I think many trainees worry because you are reviewing things with them that you might be in a position to evaluate them, and assure them that, we'll talk about this on the next slide with the competence committee, that your role as coach is actually non-evaluative. So what you will do is you will meet with your learner regularly prior to the competency committee meeting. You'll review their whole file, including their ITERs, the EPAs, OSCEs, or other test results. And this is where Calvin's comment about getting quite facile with MedSys and how to collect information is quite helpful. You'll review their personal reflections and their learning plan. And you'll coach the resident around the next steps and continued professional development through facilitation and questioning. With the goal of saying, in the short term, we're going to be seeing each other again in 2 to 3 months or whenever that next time period is. What would you like to have achieved by then? And how might we work to do that? If the issues arise, you may end up meeting with your learner between competency committee meetings if there's something that comes up. And then you'll also be expected to complete a coaching report and upload to MedSys prior to the competency committee meeting. So I have a sample coach report here. You don't need to necessarily be able to read this. It is quite small, but the idea is that you will summarize some of the things that in terms of their performance. So in this case, 78% overall. The chart that I had presented earlier about the competencies are presented on the foundation summaries. Summarize some of the ITER comments, comment on overall competence, any exam scores, there's another slide as well that goes into, you know, the learning needs, what is the resident doing well, what does the resident need to work on, and then the summary of the recommendations to the competency committee. So this can be quite high level, or it can be quite granular depending on what you're discussing, but it serves as documentation of the coaching discussion. It serves as a reminder for the resident when they are looking back at what they discussed, and it's part of the expectation. It's part of the expectation for documentation for coaches within your individual program. So I'm in the critical care program for adults, and ours looks a little like this, but not exactly the same. And so your program may develop your own coaching report, but there will be an expectation that there's some documentation. Then at the competency committee themselves, the role of the academic coach may vary depending on the size of the program. My program is quite small. We have 5 to 6 trainees per year, and the number of faculty would be quite small compared to, say, a program like internal medicine. So in our program, we are the primary reviewer of our learner. And I also am a secondary reviewer to somebody else. But some programs may have the academic coach as not a reviewer. The presenter of information, or the reviewer of information, is presenting information to the competence committee. But the expectation is that regardless of who presents the information, the coach will not vote on promotion or expectations. And that's very important to maintaining the trust of the trainee. So I may present my trainee to the group. There is a secondary reviewer. It will get discussed, and then I will recuse myself from any voting with respect to my trainee. And then at the conclusion, my competence committee will send out a report to the trainee, and sometimes as an academic coach, you may wish to follow up, particularly if it's not a progressing as expected recommendation. You may want to follow up with your trainee and debrief some of their recommendations. And some of the recommendations may come back that they want the learner to check in with their coach more frequently. So these are some of the expectations or concrete expectations of academic coaches at the level of a competence committee. Now we're scheduled to have a break. If there are any questions prior to that, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, maybe a quick break and stand up, give our legs a break, and then return. Does anyone have any questions?
I just have an observation. We started with the sports and comparison. This is the part which is the most different here, is that we are presenting our coachee to a big group which has an impact on their evaluation. So in a way, even though I don't evaluate him, I present him to somebody who will not only evaluate them, may be important in getting a job in the future. So I think this is why it becomes really different from being just a personal coaching than some kind of a middle facilitator.
I agree with you, Pooja. I think that this is a little bit, I think it runs the risk of that. Rennie just commented that the data the coach presents tends to be objective data. So as you saw in the coach report, it reflects on, this many EPAs, this many, this is the exam results, which are documentable. And something that is pulled from a learner summary. So what you're not doing is you're not presenting subjective data. Sometimes there are mitigating factors that the coach who's actually had the conversation can share that are within confidentiality, or something that the trainee is comfortable with you sharing that may change or may provide information or context around the information that's available. So for example, if the trainee shared with you that there are all of these outstanding EPAs that are waiting to be done, but people haven't completed them, and the trainee has emailed and emailed and emailed, then maybe it's actually the program director who needs to follow up with some of the faculty, as an example. It is a little bit different than coaching in that capacity, though. Robin has made a comment. In a lot of ways, coaches are often the ones making decisions, who gets to be part of the starting line, who gets to be put on the roster. So there's still some high stakes feeling decisions from a coach in the sports world. Thank you for that as well. Okay, and Calvin is not completely sold on the use of the term coach.
Heather, I was just going to say that,
Yeah.
Robin, I think your presentation really was the elephant in the room for me. When I took on this role 2 years ago, I had a sense that this was someone shouting at the sidelines, pitching to get them going. It hasn't felt like that as an academic medical coach. I'm several degrees of separation, separated from these coachees. I'm not judged, as you said, rightly said. Their success is not necessarily my success, as much as I want them to succeed. I get feedback, not because I'm there with them. I get feedback through these EPAs and their self-reflection. And I tend to check in on them at checkpoints. It's not like I'm there every Sunday with them.
Yeah, Kelvin, as I said, I went through lots of emotions, and certainly I was where you were like a few years ago when I sort of said, well, perhaps then we shouldn't call it coaching. But I think the difference is that we just have to be more clear about how we're adopting it, because in a lot of ways, the principles are still important, but we're just translating them a little bit differently. And so it has taken a long time to get there, but certainly there's a lot of confusion, initially a little bit of frustration. But I think, with really being clear about what these roles are and what these skill set are, we're still providing coaching in some ways. It's clearly not going to be equivalent to sports and music and business, but that's not the goal. And I think that's where my expectations were wrong when I came into medicine. Is the goal is not actually to have a coach like it is in sports. The goal is to have someone who helps me meet my individual potential. And in medicine, that's going to be slightly different, but I still think we can build the structure for it. So I'd be happy to chat more, but certainly I went through the same sort of reservations as you did. And I've sort of come out to this point now, sort of being able to challenge it, but still understand how it actually can bring a lot of benefit to our learners if we do it the right way.
Thank you, Robin. For me, when I thought initially, when we were thinking about coaching and I thought about sports coaching, I was imagining more the role of the coach on the sidelines as well. And to me, that's more of the coaching in the moment, as the clinical supervisor who's providing they have visual feedback. They watched you do an interaction with a patient or a procedure or something, and they're giving you moment by moment feedback on your performance. Whereas when I think about the medicine and academic coaching, although I've heard Robin's take on this and agree absolutely that there is an element of sports coaching that can be brought in. One of the things that this coaching made me think about is more along the lines of executive coaching. So if you happen to be a business professional and you're not going to have your coach sitting right next to you while you're chairing a meeting, but what you might have is you might have people you'll take information back to them. You might take 360 evaluations. You might take your own personal reflections to an executive coach, and you might sit and go through them and develop your own expectations, goals, and learning objectives and performance objectives out of a coach that is related to your environment, but isn't physically watching you. And so I think that there are many different ways that we can explore coaching that are beyond just somebody shouting at the sidelines. Thank you guys all. I think it might be a good time for us to take a wee break. And we can regroup in 10 minutes. Does that work for everyone?
Sounds great. Thanks, Heather.
Oh, I'm being told 5 minutes.
It's completely up to people. It's just that I'm respectful of people's time and wanting to end at noon. If people have flexibility by another 5 or 10 minutes past noon, that'd be great. If not, we can always start in 5 minutes, and whoever can join in 5 minutes, great. If you can join in 7 minutes, then it is what it is.
Okay.
So perhaps aim for 5, a quick bio break and filling your cup like Kelvin.
Okay, see you soon.
Hopefully everybody's filled their cups and brought something maybe to munch on. And so we're going to transition to the second half of our workshop. And we're going to start by talking about something that a lot of people have alluded to and that Heather has laid the foundations for, which is setting that educational alliance and that trusting relationship. And so I'd like to introduce Dr. Janelle McLeod from Family Medicine, who will lead us through some thoughts and talks in the next 15 minutes about how to establish that educational alliance.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Janelle McLeod. I'm one of the full-time faculties in the Department of Family Medicine. I've worked there and taught medical students and residents for about 20 years now. Thank you, Robin and Irene, for inviting me to talk today about incorporating coaching into the Educational Alliance. I hope, Alison, you have my slides and you will good. You'll move to the next one. So, the objectives are a bit broad and not that concrete, and I apologize for that. But since trust is the key element of a coach-coachee relationship, let's see if we can borrow trusting relationship from the alliance that's formed in psychotherapy and strengthen our bond in between teacher and resident in the Educational Alliance. And that might improve the feedback we give to our residents. So my fascination with coaching comes from my background. I am originally Romanian, and I've always been fascinated by the gymnasts and their coaches. So I actually spoke with Cristina Bontas, who was a 6-time world medalist in women gymnastics. And she herself was coached by the legendary Nadia Comaneci. So when I asked Cristina what was the secret of her success and what was the key element in the relationship with Nadia Comaneci, she told me it was mutual trust. So I'll just start by telling you about a case of a resident I had in my practice several years back that can illustrate a bad or a good alliance in your eyes. So it was a Labor Day weekend, and I was away from my clinical practice for about a week. My resident knew I wasn't there, so she was supervised on that Friday afternoon by one of my colleagues. So it was 9 o'clock at night, and I was camping with my family, and my resident calls me on the phone, and she was quite stressed, and she was crying on the phone. She was upset about an encounter that Friday afternoon. So she was booked to see a Syrian refugee family, and they showed up very late for the appointment. And she initially refused to see them, but the supervising physician made her see this family. So one of the kids was so sick that had to be sent to the peds ER. So she was very concerned that she was going to get a bad evaluation from my colleague supervising physician. Next slide, please. So just before we talk more about this Educational Alliance, we just need to remember what's the purpose of the feedback in medical education? Because I think coaching is all about giving effective feedback. So if we look at the purpose of the feedback is to lead to a change in knowledge, self-concept, and behavior. So traditionally, the feedback in medical education it's provided by the supervisor and directed to a learner with the emphasis on changing the content and delivery. It's very unidirectional. We think as supervisors that we give plenty of feedback. Our learners deny getting it. They're actually not asking for more feedback. What they are asking for is more reassurance. And a study shows that in a group that had some sort of feedback intervention, there was about 38% of deterioration in the performance. And still, the Pendleton rule as a feedback sandwich is not a bad way to approach feedback in medical education. Next slide, please. So as a result of this kind of mismatch in between the external feedback with learners generated internal judgments, there are 6 maladaptive responses that we often see. So feedback is often ignored, rejected, found to be irrelevant, refusing to see any connection, reinterpreted, and oftentimes they act on it superficially. Next slide, please. So Kevin Eva, who used to work at Mac, looked at feedback, and he figured that there are 3 key elements. One is learners' emotional state and their personalities. For instance, I once had a learner whose family was living in Gaza, and there was no connection. She couldn't talk even on the phone with her family. So she was in such an emotional state that every time I gave her feedback, good or bad, she would cry. And I would spend the most of the session to console her and to walk her through the whole process of the feedback. And then I would talk to her about her family and so forth. Credibility of the educator is another key element of feedback, and in general in this educational alliance that I'll talk soon about. So clearly a learner would take feedback differently from the program director than they would take it from their junior faculty. And we all know about the time interval. We can't give feedback 2 weeks after the encounter. Next slide, please. So based on all what we know about feedback in medical education, the current state is that it's too teacher-centered and unidirectional. Learner is just a passive receiver there. And the future direction is to reframe the feedback as a two-way conversation with the emphasis on learner deciding when to seek and where to seek feedback, like in coaching. So the educator this will hopefully improve this or strengthen the relationship in between the educator and learner. So next slide. So we all remember therapeutic alliance that we as clinicians use in our encounters, day-to-day encounters with patients, either through supportive counseling or through motivational interviewing. Next slide. So remember, this therapeutic alliance in psychotherapy is about understanding the goal of the therapy, having this mutual understanding in between the therapist and the patient. For instance, if the patient wants to quit smoking and they want to talk about that, so we need to agree how to work towards the goal of quitting smoking. And the key element here is the relationship in between the therapist and the patient and the client. And if the patient likes and trusts and values the therapist, the success of the therapy is going to happen. Next slide. So if we can reframe this concept and bring it, the concept from the therapeutic alliance, and bring it into the educational alliance, and it seems it's possible, according to Tilio. Summer Tilio is a psychiatrist and an educator at UBC. She feels that this can be brought into the educational alliance, this framework. So next slide. So basically, the elements of the educational alliance are exactly the same as in therapeutic alliance in psychotherapy, having the shared understanding of the performance and standard. My resident who called me while I was camping was a star resident in terms of her performance. She is very good resident, but her standards of care were questionable in a sense that her approach to patients was not very patient-centered. It could be because of the training that she did overseas, so she was more paternalistic. The other element of the educational alliance is to negotiate an agreement and an action plan. So in order to do that, while I did poorly on negotiating an agreement with her or an action plan, clearly my style before that was just to give them my cellular phone and telling them, you can call me anytime. Working together to reach a goal, that's another important element of this educational alliance. So, well, I don't know how well we work together into reaching her goals. I think her goals were not to get bad evaluations. That's the only goal she had. We've created opportunities to use feedback in her for her. So even that night, the feedback I provided for her was useless, I think. What she wanted was a reassurance. And actually what she wanted was me talking to the preceptor and avoiding to get a bad evaluation. Next slide. So I just like to maybe, I like you to, if you can unmute yourself and turn your cameras, and especially I want to hear from the residents, what characterizes a positive educational alliance? How about a negative one? And boundaries that in my case were very loose. How can we deal with that? And how can we empower our learners to seek and receive feedback? So if you guys want to unmute yourselves, and I'd like to hear your opinions. Anyone?
I think this Mike here, Mike saying, hi, is a really interesting discussion that that, you know, and it kind of harks back to a lot of our interactions with trainees. I think that they naturally seek reassurance. And I don't know what the difference is in terms of thinking back about the analogy of the sports coaching versus academic coaching, why it's more difficult to be really reflective and what, you know, to do something with that feedback as opposed to just kind of hear it but not really internalize it or use it to change what the learner does. I guess that I find is part of the challenge. I'm not sure how to overcome that sometimes. Some learners they just naturally do it, and when you give them feedback, they naturally, the next time you see them see a similar case or encounter a similar challenge, they'll be different, and they just naturally have that adaptive behavior. But others, I find, if they don't, it's I don't know how to change that piece of it.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Mike. So I think what you're raising the issue of like trust, because I think that's the key in any coach-coachee relation. And the question is, how do we build trust? How do we build trust with our learners? Maybe we can hear from a learner as well.
I think there's like a ton of factors that play for that, because I think it kind of depends on the size of your program, the exposure and all of that. Because I think you definitely feel more comfortable with different people. Like for your academic coach versus a supervisor who you've been on with for maybe a week or maybe, you know, one single clinic day or one single call shift. If it's someone who knows you and you think has an accurate sense of who you are as like a person and as a learner, I think it's a bit easier to receive that feedback. But at the same time, it kind of adds that component of you not wanting to disappoint them, which is a bit of it kind of goes against that as well, because that's kind of, I think that's kind of a feeling that a lot of, like, you know, we kind of talk about how we kind of shy away from bad feedback, kind of shy away from activating EPAs if we don't think they're going to be successful. And I think that's a bit of just like a protective quality that people naturally have. And so I think it kind of goes the same way if there's not that trust with the supervisor. And sometimes there's just simply not the time to develop the trust or the exposure. Like you might be like different rotations have a different degree of actual face time with the supervisor and the person that's completing your evaluation or that's kind of enrolled with giving you your feedback. And I think those are kind of all things that contribute to how that dynamic kind of evolves.
Thank you, Spencer. Thanks for your comments. Yeah. So looking back, who was your best? Who did you build the best relationship in your years of training? Who was that person? To me, it was the person who showed some vulnerability, who showed me that they are fine if they make a mistake, who have worked through their errors and who have become better clinicians and admitted to their errors. To me, that was the key element in building the trust with my coaches throughout my training.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, Spencer, I think this was a question for you. So.
No, I was just, yeah, exactly. I was just going to kind of answer that with saying, no, I agree completely. Like, I think it's definitely, I think it's a component of that, of people who, I think, you know, there are certain supervisors who make it clear that you're kind of expected, you know, you're not expected to be a staff physician right away. They kind of recognize exactly what's expected of you. And so even if you are making mistakes, you're able to kind of situate yourself at your level of a trainee. And then also the ones that are kind of realistic with you about how, you know, you're not always going to be perfect. There's going to be mistakes. There's going to be kind of struggles, and it's going to be a process. And so I do kind of agree. It's those people that kind of feel more human that you feel much more comfortable receiving that feedback from.
Thank you. Thanks. It's easier to connect, I think, if you see that human side of your preceptor and supervisor.
I would definitely echo that, Yonel. I think both as a trainee in the past, but also as a supervisor, I almost feel at times I'm wondering, I'm like, am I sharing too much? But I think when you bring it to the personal level and share with the trainee a time that, I mean, just recently I was talking to our PGY4 is preparing for the OSCE, and, you know, and I would share how in one of my OSCE stations, I made what at the time I thought was a horrible mistake, and clearly I passed the exam. So I think when you do show vulnerability or beyond that, you know, a horrible encounter with a patient, I think, you know, you certainly notice that they pay attention, and you've kind of led this, listen, I'm not perfect, I'm human. And it took trials and errors and learning and mistakes and learning from those, you know, to get me, and I continue to learn. So I think that definitely resonates with people. And then some of our trainees who maybe are coming from more traditional backgrounds where the growth mindset is not as valued, or they're not as primed, you know, it may help them let that guard down and actually, you know, allow themselves to probe deeper and reflect. The other thing, if I think who stands in my mind, I think are people who showed interest in you as a human, who actually, like, you know, I remember being a medical student in IWK in Halifax, and Dr. Dooley, who sadly passed away last year, was a great neurologist. And I remember a lot of neuro that he taught me, but I remember him going down, you know, for Tim Hortons and actually asking where I'm from, and, you know, chatting a bit about, like, it, you know, genuinely showing interest, finding a moment of time and showing interest to connect with this. You know, I was there for 2 weeks, he could have ignored me. And that really resonated.
So for him to be able to do that in the 2-week span, he was a very good coach. Yeah. So we usually need lots of time. I've been asked to wrap up, so we can move to the next slide, and I'm going to wrap up. It's so basically we need to empower our learners, and the top paragraph describes our sort of the learner we all had, the super great keen learner, but at the end of the day, we can't change the personalities and the emotional states of our learners, but we can do something about empowering us as teachers and improving the way we deliver that feedback, the way we connect with our learners, and the way we work with that alliance. And this is really the last slide. Can we move to the next one? So We all have the skills to do psychotherapy because we are all clinicians, and we kind of use those skills in our day-to-day clinics, be it through supportive counseling or motivational interviewing. Remember to use the framework, the same framework in the Educational Alliance, and we know that the learners identify the relationship with their preceptors as a major determinant of the feedback and how it's processed. And work on building trust over time, showing vulnerability, getting to know your learner, and this will empower our learners to adapt to variable settings of feedback and to learn when to seek feedback. Thanks. Thank you. There are some papers. I can send more papers related to these concepts.
And then I think I'm the next one up. So I was just asked to kind of chat with a few of the other residents and kind of talk about what people have felt they really got out of their academic coaching kind of dyads. A lot, we've talked a lot about kind of the formal roles today, but as you might kind of guess, with this longitudinal relationship, oftentimes it kind of evolves, and it's very highly personalized and flexible about what it kind of becomes. Do you mind going to the next slide? Perfect. So these are just kind of some of the common things that people brought up that they found valuable about the experience. It's kind of, oftentimes they bounce ideas off of their academic coach. They really make sure that they're staying on track with their progress. And a big part of this is kind of that affirming nature that we talked about, is making sure that as time goes by, rotations go by, that you still feel like you're accomplishing everything and that you have that reassurance that things are kind of going as expected. And you also, this is all kind of in combination with the competency committee, and just making sure you feel like you do have that sensation of being kind of on track. The other part is a lot of people found it very helpful that they get this extra kind of person to discuss their evals with, and they found it very, very helpful for guiding reflection, especially to help put it in the context of their entire residency journey. And then kind of some of the more practical stuff. We did talk about this goal setting a lot, so I don't have to kind of go into that too much. But the other thing is this is more they get a sense, oftentimes you discuss your career plans, and in specialties like pediatrics, internal medicine, you hear a lot about people discussing what subspecialties they're considering, and academic, community, and really figuring out their electives and selectives. And oftentimes the academic coach ends up being kind of a resource to help plan out how you're going to make your rotation schedule kind of get you to where you want to go. Do you mind going to the next slide? Perfect. And then beyond this, as we kind of alluded to with there's a lot of flexibility as time goes on. And a lot of people state that they find they end up having kind of intersections with their academic coach with these other roles. A lot of people find that their academic coach can be their advocate if they're struggling or if they've had some subpar evaluations. Oftentimes the academic coach is the person you really get to kind of state your case to and really have on your side. Or if something in your personal life comes up and things like that, a lot of residents say that someone that they feel comfortable kind of approaching with this is their academic coach. There's a tremendous amount of opportunity to be an advocate for a learner through this. The other like mentorship, sponsorship, these are all things that kind of, it really depends on how good of a fit it is. And there is some variability. In terms of mentorship, there is a ton of opportunity for this, kind of going beyond those typical coaching roles. And something I've found very helpful is the sponsorship side of it. I'm currently planning a master's degree, and my academic coach is always kind of checking in to see how that's going, seeing if there's anyone she can connect me with. We bounce ideas off of where the best place to do it, the best type of program, because there's someone who eventually becomes very in tune with your career goals. And there's tons of opportunity for sponsorship to kind of intersect with that. And a lot of what we've kind of talked about has really touched on this, while respecting psychological safety. Oftentimes people do find that their academic coach is their ally. Actually, I kind of quoted Blake from our Academic Coach 2.0 dry run when he had said that we were talking about, how personal can you go with your coachee and the coach dyad. And he had made the comment about opening doors rather than prying. Oftentimes, it's a bit tricky to figure out how personal is too personal, kind of how Boyana had alluded to. But basically being there as someone that if there is a personal stressor or something that is impacting clinical or academic performance, that they feel comfortable bringing it up with you, because oftentimes along with the program directors, you often end up being one of the point persons for them. And then other than that, just kind of as we said, ultimately, a lot of learners feel like their academic coach is really someone that's on their team. And I think this is a very valuable addition to a lot of residency training programs. And I think it's one of the elements of CBME, which has gotten the most positive feedback from learners. I'm not really too sure if there's a ton of data to support that, but anecdotally, that's really what I've kind of heard in my role as the chair for the CBME resident subcommittee. And a lot of people are just happy to have someone that really gets to know their progress and can really give them that well-informed feedback based on a ton of information with a lot of context, and they find it really helpful for their career progression. So that's kind of it from me, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask.
Okay. Well, thank you, Spencer, and thank you to everyone so far. We've had a really nice overview of like the coaching concept in general, the Educational Alliance, the resident feedback, and now I'm here to try to provide you with a little bit of a toolbox on how to approach the coaching conversation and just give you some options of some models that you can turn to when you are either a new coach or you just need a little bit of structure to kind of get the conversation rolling. Next, okay, so the first one is the R2C2 model. So this one is basically starting with what was originally described as an approach to discussing an ITER with a resident, but it's adaptable for any coaching conversation. And with all these models, we really want to just focus on the resident and really trying to establish that rapport and that relationship that's been discussed, to kind of get to know the resident a little bit. And sometimes it can really just be a short conversation in a shorter kind of setting, and other times it can, build over time if you spend more time with the resident. But it really helps to kind of have that open-ended question. Tell me about your experience, to kind of start that rapport building. And from there, go on with some questions to explore how the resident kind of reacted to the feedback that they've received, whether it was on the ITER or the EPAs or the comments, and the specific content. And from there, build on, how they can act to kind of make some changes and improve on their performance. And it's really helpful to try to ask some questions to really give that specific future timeline and help hone in on some actions to take them to really where they would like to be in the future. Next slide, please. Another model is called the GROW model. And this is just another acronym. The GROW stands for goals, reality, options, and taking a way forward. So it's pretty straightforward. We know about asking for goals, but where we really need to kind of dig a little deeper is how do we, build on that relationship, that conversation about asking for goals. So what would you like to achieve? What would success look like? Those are just nice ways of kind of asking the question a little bit more broadly. And again, getting the resident to really provide their reflection and their answers. And then looking at, the present reality and asking them things like what's worked in the past, what didn't, what are the limitations, leading there to some options on what potential solutions could they have to get them to the way forward. So what should they be doing next? How can that be supported? And again, kind of looking into the future towards that action plan and setting some really smart goals. Next slide, please. So the final kind of feedback grid, and this will, pick any of these grids, they'll help us with our next case and hopefully with some coaching conversations in the future as well. But again, trying to focus on the resident and their ideas, and the coach can of course supplement those ideas and provide more guidance. So in the feedback grid, this is a model for feedback delivery that can be useful for coaching conversations. And again, it's just asking questions like, what would the resident like to continue working on? What's worked well? What's had impact? What can they do more of? What can be beneficial, and specific actions, again, that they can take to do those things. And then that consider is to reflect again on themes and actions and goals. And then sometimes a really actionable point is to really say what to do less of, or what they can stop doing, or what they can change and tweak a little bit to improve on their performance. So with these 3 models in mind, and any other models that you may have encountered in your own kind of coaching experiences, I'll present Joey's case. And the cases we've chosen, the first one was very intentional. We wanted to provide all the EPAs and the learner reflection and the ITERs and various other things, which I know were a little bit overwhelming, but then kind of summarized it nicely to just let you have some practice in the breakout room. This one is not as overwhelming with respect to the EPAs and everything else. It's a little bit more of a summary. And just to review kind of what we'll be expecting to talk about with Joey Hamilton, this is a resident who's had a history of a provisional satisfactory rotation in foundations. So this resident has already had some hiccups along the way, but did have a successful remediation and is progressing well. But now they're up for review from promotion from core to transition to practice, and they've received another unsatisfactory ITER. So you as the academic coach will be meeting with Joey to discuss progress and their areas of improvement. And in that learner summary, some of the areas of improvement were highlighted, things to focus on, but the basic messages were areas to improve on included situational awareness, attention to detail, trying to be more proactive and plan ahead, working on confidence, both in knowledge as well as skills, as well as clinical judgment. Next slide. So as we did before, we will have a resident, hopefully, or whoever's brave enough to play the role of Joey, and then someone who can stand up and play the role of academic coach as well when we get into the breakout rooms. And remember to try to apply some of the coaching models we just reviewed and get the resident to use some reflective practice. And as a coach, try to ask some of those provocative questions that were in some of the example models. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Case 2 was a little different, a little more challenging. Definitely some more acting skills were seen in our breakout rooms. And I hope everyone enjoyed sort of the difference in this case. Again, we didn't want to get bogged down in the details of the data that comes through MedSys or anything. We just provided a summary to kind of set the stage for a more challenging coaching conversation. Would anyone like to share any sort of take-home messages or reflections from the breakout? I'll just say a little bit more in our group. There was sort of discussion about the whole approach, trying to use some of those tools in the toolbox and kind of make them your own. But our discussions also kind of branched into that gray zone between mentorship versus coaching, sort of the whole language around coaching and mentorship, how close to get, how personal to get, and really, trying again to build that educational alliance, which was kind of beautifully exhibited in one of our role plays. Any other kind of concepts or themes that came through? Perhaps people are getting hungry. So I'll go to my summary slide. And again, thanks for everyone's participation. So really some of the take-home messages, and I'm sure there were many, many more in your individual sessions, but we really wanted to kind of emphasize what, I was talking about. The educational alliance is really critical and essential to coaching over time and building that trust, and that the baseline is it's a non-judgmental experience. It's not linked to assessment, and just really relaying to the trainee that you are on their side to try to make them the best that they can be. Really trying to create that patient supportive kind of coaching relationship to open up a more defensive resident who's a little bit more resistant to change, to try to get them to reflect a little bit more, and then to try to find that way forward with some new goals. And again, some of the sort of hidden subliminal messages there if it came through in some of your sessions, is that some residents may be, struggling with some non-medical expert reasons that can be affecting their performance. So how far to go into exploring those things, and then when to redirect them to the appropriate resources. And with that, I will segue to Irini.
So this is just going to take us home to bring this all full circle and to summarize academic coaching in one slide. Really, it's the cornerstone to academic coaching that I think we've all appreciated today is establishing and reinforcing that educational alliance at each of the meetings. And that this is a process, so it doesn't happen overnight. Every moment is a moment taken towards establishing that alliance. And the role of the coach is multiple. It's interpreting that data. And it takes time, especially with a new format like MedSys with an array of data, a lot of it really hidden in there, but very rich, to go through it and interpret it. And then to take that data with the learner and help promote that reflection. To be in a position where you're not creating the goals for them, but helping with co-creation of goals and strategies. Then there's the day-to-day task or what's required, and it's preparing reports for competence committee. Sometimes presenting at the competence committee if that's how your program has set it up. For some programs, like we said, the academic coach doesn't present and is there present to advocate, not to vote. Debriefing with the resident is also a key role for the academic coach to come back with the competence committee decision and to help explore reactions and ways forward. Reviewing performance, good performance, excellent performance, not so good performance, and where do we go from here? And a huge point of what we had discussed in our breakout room was really that accountability, where the difference between a coach and a mentor. A coach keeps people accountable to goals, and there's work to be done in between the coaching sessions. And really modeling that investment in their learner growth through all the rhetoric and the choice of language in each of the meetings, and modeling that growth mindset ourselves in our roles as academics and as clinicians. This is, it was a 3-hour workshop. It's a bit of an introduction to and a bit of a whirlwind, but we realize that this is not going to be enough, that you will want to keep working on your skills as a coach. And we wanted to point you out to a few excellent, well-established resources out there. So the Royal College has some beautiful online modules for coaching. All of our slides are going to be available to you. Allison can definitely send them to you by email, but they will also shortly be up on our CBME website under the resources section. So these modules on the Royal College are great ones that we would point you towards. Similarly, there's more online modules from the Royal College. Similarly, our own website, our cbmepg.mcmaster.ca, we would really encourage you to use that to help you kind of navigate the different resources out there. We've heard time and time again that there's just this flood, a tsunami of resources, and it's hard to kind of decide which ones to go to. So we've tried to take that work out from you and put it on us. So we've vetted some resources and we've put them under the different headings. So feel free to navigate through our website for your multiple roles. You might be an academic coach, but you might also be a competence committee member, et cetera. And we have them all lined up by roles in CBME. There's also some resources in terms of podcasts and Keyline podcasts and other coaching guides that we will provide to you. Again, ones that you can maybe use as you're driving in or jogging or walking, or I guess, making food for the kids. And I'll take this opportunity to put a plug in to our upcoming Academic Coaching 2.0 workshop, which is in May the 5th, so around the corner. So if you haven't signed up and you're interested, please do so. It's not too late. And this is taking us to the point of, now you have a concept and a framework for being an academic coach and the differences between coaching and mentorship, importance of establishing the educational alliance. And now we're going to be taking it to one step further. So how do we use concepts and tenets of motivational interviewing for motivational coaching, and tons of time put in there for practice. And we have Catherine Munn, who's the Assistant Dean for Resident Affairs, who is going to be a key and instrumental guest speaker and a facilitator for our workshop. So I do encourage you to, if you're interested and have the time, to please sign up and join us for that workshop. This is a few, but not all of the faces that have gone into preparing this workshop. some references. And with that, I'd like to also take the opportunity to thank our workshop committee members for this workshop, Dr. Blake Yaraskevich, Dr. Heather Whittingham, Dr. Mary Zakos, Dr. Mackin, Robin Mackin, I'm horrible with names, Dr. Van Mill from our resident section. I'm trying to remember the last name for our second resident colleague, and it's escaping me. So Dr. Van Mill, please do join in and remind
Dr.
me.
Wakeling.
Dr. Wakeling, and Lisa Kaliza and Allison Paquette from our CBME office, who are the backbone of all of our CBME offerings. With that, I would like to conclude. We have a 3 minutes. We are ahead of time by 3 minutes. If there's any questions or comments, please, we are always looking for ways to improve. We ourselves would like to model a growth mindset. So please send us your comments. There's also an evaluation that Allison will be sending out. So please take the time to complete that. This also can be, you can use that for, use this workshop for self-learning in your MOC credits. I believe that's section 2.0. So please feel free to do that. We are working on accrediting our full series of workshops. And so until we have that, you can definitely use this for more of a self-directed. So thank you to everyone. And thank you as well. I'd like to take this time to say we've had some partnership, really beautiful partnerships start with Western Ontario, with Robin Mackin and a few others who have attended today. So we'd like to thank them for their presence and for their insight. And we look forward to this partnership growing and a co-learning model that will start.
And thank you, Irene,
Thank
for
you,
your
everybody.
leadership. Yeah.
Thanks.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks all.